Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have our Mox Pro patron Brandon, piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. This deck seeks to grind advantage using its commander before going for a Thassa's Oracle or Underworld Breach line. Brandon's opening hand contains an Ancient Tomb, Fierce Guardianship, Enlightened Tutor, Mistcast, Force of Negation, Mox Opal, and a Gemstone Caverns. Next, we have Alana, piloting the partner pair of Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, and Silas Wrenn, Seeker Adept. This deck seeks to resolve an Adnos as fast as possible and win with Oracle or Breach lines. Alana's opening hand contains a Blood Crypt, Chrome Mox, Yawgmoth's Will, Windfall, Cabal Ritual, Time Twister, and a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. After that, we have Chris, piloting the partner pair of Dargo the Shipwrecker and Jeska, Thrice Reborn. This deck seeks to generate infinite mana and storm using Dargo or can one-shot opponents with Jeska. Chris's opening hand contains an Imperial Recruiter, Strike It Rich, Rift Bolt, Mountain, Pyrokinesis, and his Lena Mulligans are Underworld Breach and Mirage Mirror. Finally, we have Mike, piloting Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. This deck seeks to ramp on mana using its commander and flip massive threats onto the battlefield. Mike's opening hand contains a Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, Gilded Drake, Green Sun Zenith, Mox Diamond, Snow-Covered Forest, and a Snow-Covered Island. Without further ado, let's kick off with Zesty Zealous Zany Zeitgeist. Chris won the Celeb Lookalike contest and gets to start us off. But Brandon has the pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mox Opal. Chris draws a card for turn and plays a mountain. He casts Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. Chris passes. Mike draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Snow-Covered Forest. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. In response, Brandon casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up Aristic Study onto the top of his library. Kinnan resolves, and Mike casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Gilded Drake. He casts Mox Opal. He casts a Green Sun Zenith, where X equals 3. In response, Brandon casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Green Sun Zenith. All through, Mike ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Aristic Study. Brandon passes to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Chrome Mox. Ristic triggers and Brandon draws. Chrome Mox resolves and Alana imprints Time Twister. She casts an Arcane Signet and Brandon draws again. She casts a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer and Brandon draws again. Alana ships the turn. Chris draws, plays a Mountain, and passes. Mike draws, plays an Exotic Orchard, and also passes. Brandon draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast the One Ring. It enters, and Brandon gains protection from everything. Brandon activates the One Ring. In response, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting a Tidespell Tyrant onto the battlefield. Then Brandon adds a Burden counter and draws a card. Brandon ships the turn. Alana draws and moves to combat. She attacks Chris with Ragavan. Chris takes it, Ragavan triggers, Alana creates a treasure, and Chris exiles a mountain off of the top of his library. In her second main phase, she casts Ristic Study. Ristic triggers and Brandon draws. She casts her commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, and Brandon draws again. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Chris casts Pyrokinesis for its alternate cost, exiling a red card, targeting Kinnan, Rograkh, and Ragavan, paying for both Ristics. They all die, and the turn moves to Chris. Chris draws and dashes in a Ragavan. Both Ristics trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Chris creates a treasure, and Alana exiles, calling the weak. Chris passes, and Ragavan returns to his hand. Mike draws and plays a forest. He casts Flesh Duplicate. Tidespell triggers, and Mike bounces Mox Opal to his hand. Both Ristics trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. Flesh Duplicate enters as a copy of Tidespell Tyrant. He casts Mox Opal. 2 Tidespouts and both Ristics trigger. Mike pays for both Ristics, then the Tidespout spawns Alana's Ristic and Mike's Chrome Mox. He casts Chrome Mox. 2 Tidespouts and Ristic trigger. Mike pays for Ristic, then the Tidespouts bounce Brandon's Ristic and Mike's Mox Opal. Chrome Mox enters and Mike doesn't imprint. Mike presents a loop of casting each artifact, bouncing the other, and bouncing an opponent's permanent. He does this over and over until everyone's permanents are bounced. Unfortunately, he cannot tap these artifacts for mana due to their restrictions, so Mike moves to combat and attacks Alana with Tidespout. Alana takes it, and Mike ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Underground Sea. He passes, discarding to hand size. Alana draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. She taps it to cast an Arcane Signet. She casts a Kraum Mox imprinting Yawgmoth's Will. She passes. Chris draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mountain. Chris passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Alana casts Snap, targeting Tidespout Tyrant. Tidespout bounces and Alana untaps her Ancient Tomb and Chris's Mountain in order to ensure everyone has interaction for Mike's turn. Still in the end step, Chris casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Mike's other Tidespout. Tidespout is destroyed, and the turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and casts Kraum Mox, imprinting Nyx's Bloom Ancient. He recasts his commander, Kinnan. Mike chips the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Brandon ends his turn. Alana draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps Ancient Tomb to recast Rhystic Study. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. She recasts her commander, Rograkh, and Brandon draws again. Alana passes the turn. Chris draws and casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw. Chris ends his turn. Mike draws and casts Basalt Monolith. Rhystic's trigger and Alana and Brandon draw. In response, Brandon casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws a card. Basalt is countered and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Kinnan. Brandon takes it and Mike passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Drannith Magistrate, paying for Rhystic. Brandon chips the turn. Alana draws and plays a Badlands. She taps Ancient Tomb to cast Talisman of Indulgence. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. Alana passes. Chris draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Chris creates a treasure, and Alana exiles a Swan Song. Chris passes. Mike draws, holds open mana, and passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast the One Ring. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. It enters and Brandon gains protection from everything. Brandon passes to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Watery Grave, into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Windfall. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. In response, Brandon casts Swan Song. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. In response, Alana casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing Watery Grave, targeting Swan Song. Rhystic triggers and, in response, Chris casts Pyroblast, targeting Windfall. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw. In response, Alana casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Pyroblast. Rhystic Study triggers and Brandon draws a card. In response, Brandon activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. With nothing else, Force counters Pyroblast, Brandon draws from Rhystic, Daze counters Swan Song, and with Windfall still in the stack, Alana casts Cabal Ritual. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws a card. Alana adds 3 black, and with Windfall still in the stack, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting an Elvish Spirit Guide onto the battlefield. Still in response, Mike casts Swan Song, targeting Windfall. Both Rhystics trigger, Mike pays for Alana's, and Brandon draws a card. Then Swan Song counters Windfall, and Alana creates a 2/2 burn. Next, Alana casts a Mana Crypt, and Brandon draws. She casts a Wheel of Fortune, and Brandon draws from Rhystic. With no interaction left, Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7. She casts Talisman of Creativity, and Brandon draws a card. She casts the One Ring. Brandon draws from Rhystic, and the One Ring resolves. It enters, and Alana gains protection from everything. Alana ships the turn to Chris. Chris draws and casts Pyretic Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and both players draw. Chris adds 3 red, then casts Overmaster. Rhystic triggers, and both players draw again. Chris draws from Overmaster, then plays a Sekinsan, Crucible of Defiance for turn. He casts a Soul Ring, and both players draw a card. He casts Rending Volley, targeting Drannith, and both players draw. Drannith dies, and Chris casts Birgi, God of Storytelling. Rhystic trigger, and both players draw a card. Chris passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Rhystic Study triggers, and both players draw a card. He casts Copy Artifact, and both draw again. It enters as a copy of the One Ring, and Mike gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He casts a Spellskite, and both draw from Rhystic. Mike ships the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon loses a life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts Silence. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. In response, Alana casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Silence. In response, Brandon casts Spell Pierce, targeting Force. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws a card. Spell Pierce counters Force, and with Silence still in the stack, Alana casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Silence. In response, Brandon casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Fierce. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. In response, Mike pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Silence. Rhystic triggers, and both players draw again. Silence is countered, and Brandon casts Kraum Mox. Alana draws from Rhystic, and then Brandon imprints a Windfall. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills 27 cards. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, and Alana draws a card. He cracks LED, discards his hand, adding 3 white. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Underworld Breach in his graveyard. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. In response, Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Seaborn Muse onto the battlefield. With Savine still on the stack, Mike casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Savine's Reclamation. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw. With no answers, Mindbreak Trap exiles Savine's Reclamation. With nothing to do, Brandon passes to Mike. At the end of Brandon's turn, Alana exiles Savine's Spirit Guide from her hand, adding a red. She casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Kinnan. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws a card. Kinnan is destroyed and the turn moves to Alana. Mike untaps with Alana through Seedborn. During her upkeep, the One Ring and Mana Crypt trigger. In response, Mike activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts March of Swirling Mist, targeting Rograkh. Both Rhystics trigger, Mike pays for Alana's, and then Brandon draws. Rograkh phases out, and Alana loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, then loses the life to the One Ring. She draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. She casts Gamble. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. Then Alana fetches up a card into her hand and then randomly discards a Scalding Tarn. She plays a Mana Confluence for turn. She taps it to help cast Tidal Barracuda. In response, Mike casts Mana Drain. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw a card. In response, Alana casts Pyroblast, targeting Mana Drain. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws again. Pyroblast counters Mana Drain, and then Tidal Barracuda resolves. Next, she casts a Mana Vault. She casts a Grim Monolith. She casts a Springleaf Drum. She taps her Talisman to cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. She taps her other Talisman to cast Praetor's Grasp, targeting Mike. Which she isn't supposed to do because Mike has protection from everything from the One Ring. The table missed it, but magic is hard. Anyway, Alana fetches up a card from Mike's library into exile, face down. She casts the card, which is a Mana Crypt. She casts Vampiric Tutor. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. She casts Jeska's Will. She exiles LED and 2 lands off of the top of her library. She casts Underworld Breach. She casts LED from exile. She cracks it, discards her hand, and adds 3 red. She escapes Gamble, fetching up a Brain Freeze into her graveyard since she has no cards in hand. She escapes LED, cracks it for 3 blue, then escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting herself. She does this over and over, milling her library. She escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alana wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a wild match. Congrats to Alana on her win. Her deck is built to be super resilient and play through a lot of interaction at the table. This is further compounded by the fact that Alana is an excellent pilot of the deck. She timed her interaction perfectly and was able to close it out tonight. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Rhystic Study. Yes, this is the most valuable card in a lot of games, but that's because it's so good. Once it hits the battlefield, you're fighting against that player to outpace them. You can either play your spells and lose advantage, or tax yourself and lose advantage. It is a lose-lose situation that is very hard to recover from and overcome. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.